Hi there, this is Andy from Blessed Man Meditations. Recently, Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic posted a video containing about 40 arguments for atheism. I have no personal vindictive vendetta against Alex or against any other atheist. I love Alex, and I love all atheists as my fellow people, all created in God's image. But I believe their epistemology is wrong and needs to be responded to. This video will be part of a lengthy series I plan to do in response to each argument Alex makes. So please like this video, comment, and please subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
Atheists,
Mustard seed.
the Gospels were anonymous. Okay, anonymous doesn't mean we have no idea who wrote them. It just means the names of the authors aren't signed in the text itself. But we literally have writings from church fathers who knew the apostles and can verify that they indeed wrote the books named after them.
Okay, the consensus of New Testament scholars seems to be that we don't have sufficient evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels. But what was it that you just said? We literally have writings from church fathers who can verify the traditional authorship of the Gospels. You've shown a picture on screen of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who, look, I don't know very much about, but I think you've basically just lied about him. We only know anything about him at all via his letters and tradition. Tradition, which states he was a disciple of John, but with very patchy evidence. Some of Ignatius's followers wrote an account of his martyrdom that says he was a disciple of John. So, sure, maybe Ignatius knew John. But where the hell have you gotten this idea that Ignatius can verify John's authorship of the fourth gospel? Even in the letters Ignatius allegedly wrote to John, now recognized to be forgeries anyway, we don't have any clear endorsement from Ignatius of the idea that John wrote this gospel. It seems that Ignatius's epistles were influenced by the theology of John's gospel, so he probably read it, but that's a far cry from making any commentary about its authorship. For the record, church patristics is really not my area. I don't know very much here, so don't look to me for advice on this. I actually reached out to one of my old theology tutors to see if he could help me figure out what I might be missing, but look, I might just be missing something here. I'm genuinely interested in seeing where Redeemed Zoomer has gotten this evidence that Ignatius can confirm that John wrote the fourth gospel. So if you're watching this, RZ, let me know.
One of O'Connor's objections to Christianity, reasons for atheism, is the anonymity of the gospel authorship. This presentation is meant to be a response to the accusation that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. The Bible gives us 4 accounts of Christ's life. Each records a unique perspective on the most significant event in all of human history, the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. All 4 Gospels are named after men who lived during or shortly after Christ's earthly ministry. Tradition considers these men the authors, but there's one problem. Not one of these books names its author. Critical scholars of the New Testament hold that we do not know who really wrote the Gospels. While modern Bibles attribute the 4 Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, these names were added later. Bart Ehrman contends, famous agnostic, former pastor Bart Ehrman contends, that the Gospels' titles didn't arrive until a century after they were written. In Ehrman's view, later Christians added the superscriptions containing authorship to give the 4 Gospels their much-needed authority. Ehrman says the Gospels were not written for 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death and were not written by eyewitnesses, but by the subsequent generation. Ehrman says that when Christians recognized they needed to appeal to a apostolic authority, they attributed the Gospels to the apostles. Ehrman says that the surviving manuscripts contain a wide variety of titles, and he says the titles were later added by scribes. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the Gospels were anonymous, and we did not know who wrote them. Does that mean that we should completely discredit them? If we were to discredit the Gospels solely because they were anonymous, we would have to remove some of the great works of literary history, which were also published anonymously. You can look up, like I did, famous works of history that were published anonymously, and you could find hundreds of famous, respected works of literary history that were published anonymously. And their And if there are nonfiction, and surely among those there are other nonfiction, famous, important works of history that were published anonymously. Just because it's published anonymously doesn't mean that it has to be disregarded. If Ehrman's correct, the Gospels were not really written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but instead were anonymous. If Ehrman's to be believed, the early Christians connected themselves with the original apostles and therefore lent credibility to the Gospels. Ehrman arrives at this conclusion because Ehrman claims there is a wide variety of titles found in the Gospel manuscripts. Some say that the closest we get to a claim of authorship is at the very end of the book of John, where the author implies that the book was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved. The earliest Gospel manuscripts in which the titles survive seem to have been copied in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. We have Papyrus 66, perhaps Papyrus 4, and Papyrus 75. That's a century or more after the Gospels were originally written. That's one part of the evidence that causes some scholars to make the claim that the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous. We do not possess the original documents written by the authors of the Gospels, but to be fair, we do not currently possess any original manuscripts from antiquity. With the Gospels, however, several thousand copies have come down to us from history, far more than any other ancient document. What other context clues can we use to determine the authors? Can we trust tradition's assumptions about who wrote the Gospels? Did the early church fathers know more about the Gospel's authorship than we know now? Why do skeptical scholars continue to claim that the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous? According to Ehrman, skeptical scholars continue to claim the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous due to a wide variety of different titles. From his perspective, the different titles demonstrates the titles were added in different locations long after the books began to circulate. But in almost every instance, the variety that he says there is limited to whether the Gospel says according to, or whether it says the Gospel according to, and it names the author in each one. In some manuscripts, the title is the Gospel according to the ascribed author. In other titles, it's simply according to the ascribed author. The difference is the difference between a full title and an abbreviated title, nothing more. That abbreviation accounts for nearly every instance of Ehrman's supposed wide variety in the Gospel titles. It's a little misleading of a claim by Ehrman, if I don't say so. You have to take these skeptical claims look at them very closely, because they frame them in such a way that they sound convincing and dangerous. But really, many times, it's not as they would like you to think. You have to look at it more closely. Same with many of the Old Testament issues that skeptics will find problems with, or the biblical issues in general. You have to look at them closely. All the New Testament Gospel manuscripts, without exceptions, contain superscriptions at the beginning of the traditional authors' names. This is true regardless of the language or age of the manuscript. While we might speculate whether or not the original documents contained a title, all ancient manuscripts do indeed have this title. Throughout the titled manuscripts, the literary forms of the titles may shift, but the same author is ascribed to the same gospel in every titled manuscript. Despite Ehrman's confident pronouncement to the contrary, there's no wide variety of titles. So either Ehrman's mistaken or he's intentionally trying to mislead people and deceive people. Ehrman's wide variety isn't really that wide after all, especially when we recognize that in the titled manuscripts of the New Testament Gospels, there are no variations in which the authors are ascribed to which Gospels. For example, the title of Matthew's Gospel in the manuscript known as Codex Washingtonianus is the Gospel according to Matthew, while the title of Matthew's Gospel in the Gospel is of the Gospel in Codex Sinaiticus is according to Matthew, but both codices explicitly ascribe the Gospel to the same source, Matthew. In the same way, Mark's Gospel in Codex Alexandrinus is Gospel according to Mark, whereas Codex Vaticanus has the abbreviated title according to Mark, spread across the tops of its 2 pages, or spread across tops of 2 pages, but both recognize Mark as its author. So there's not a wide variety of even if the title appears slightly varied across manuscripts, it's still ascribed to the same source. This is the pattern that persists in every surviving gospel manuscript that includes a title. Although the wording of the titles may differ slightly, the ascribed author never changes. Every titled manuscript of John ascribes authorship to John, never to Mark or Matthew or Peter or Andrew or anyone else. Every titled manuscript of Luke ascribes authorship to Luke, and the same is true of every titled manuscript of Matthew and Mark. So it's really not as Ehrman would have you believe. He's either mistaken or intentionally being deceptive. So, the earliest gospel manuscripts in which titles have survived seem to have been copied in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. That's a century or more after the Gospels were originally written, and that's one part of the evidence that causes some scholars to make the claim the New Testament Gospels were originally anonymous. But does the absence of titles provide evidence that the Gospels had circulated anonymously, that the titles were added in the 2nd century? Not necessarily. In the 2nd century, the New Testament Gospel spread rather rapidly from church to church throughout the Roman Empire. Gospels could be found in Rome, where Justin the philosopher referred to Mark's Gospel as the Memoirs of Peter. In Asiana, where a pastor named Papias was gathering information about their origins from eyewitnesses. In Lyon, where another pastor known as Irenaeus relied on the 4 Gospels to refute heretical teachers in his church, and probably as far as Egypt. Given the wide geographic distribution of the Gospels in the 2nd century, what do you suppose would have happened if the 2nd century Christians had suddenly decided to start fabricating names of the Gospels to make them seem more authoritative? Remember, Christians in one region could not quickly contact Christians in other regions, and even if it had been possible to get the same information to everyone at the same time, there was no single human authority who could require all Christians everywhere to link the same titles with the same Gospels. As a result, if 2nd century Christians had fabricated the authors of the Gospels, one church might have christened a Gospel with the name of Andrew, while another congregation ascribed the same Gospel to Peter or Thaddeus or Bartholomew, or one of the others. If that had occurred, we really would find Ehrman's supposed wide variety of manuscript titles. Each gospel would have had a variety of different names in different manuscripts depending on where in the Roman Empire your ship happened to land. But that pattern's not even close to what we find when we examine the ancient manuscripts. Manuscripts have not survived sufficiently intact for us to know whether or not the manuscripts originally included titles. Portions of the manuscripts that would have preserved the titles have crumbled into dust or become separated from the rest of the manuscripts over the centuries. Sometimes the title in ancient manuscripts were written on tops of pages, but they were also frequently inscribed on flyleaves at the beginning or end of a manuscript. In other cases, titles were written on tags known as silly boy and sewn to the closing edges of the document. If titles were preserved on flags or flyleaves, it's quite likely these deteriorated or that they've been lost over the centuries. As such, the absence of titles on the surviving portions of manuscripts does not mean that no names were originally present in any portions of these manuscripts. Examine all the manuscripts that have survived sufficiently intact to include any title we discover that not one of these manuscripts omits the ascription to the author. In every manuscript that survives sufficiently intact for a title to be present, there's a title, and the title links the text to the same author that's ascribed to the Gospel in our New Testament today. The first and perhaps biggest problem for the theory of the anonymous Gospels is this: no anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John have ever been found. They do not exist. As far as we know, they never have. In a world where communication was far from instant and the church was decentralized, how could the same author's names possibly have been linked to the same Gospels with such uniform consistency? I suggest that the most reasonable way to account for this uniformity is to recognize that each New Testament Gospel was linked to a particular author from the moment the text first began to circulate. Perhaps this was because the author's names were inscribed on silly boy and flyleaf that told readers who wrote the Gospels, or perhaps it was because an oral history of each Gospel's origins that was passed from church to church whenever one community of believers shared a Gospel with another community. Quite possibly both of these phenomena were happening at the same time. If an oral account of each Gospel's origins or a written inscription did accompany each Gospel as soon as it began to circulate, it shouldn't surprise us to find accounts of the origins of the Gospels in ancient sources separated by hundreds of miles, and in fact that's precisely what we discover in the words that have survived from the 2nd century. All New Testament Gospel manuscripts, without exception, contain the superscriptions. regardless of the language or age of the manuscript. When we speculate whether or not the original documents contained a title, all manuscripts do have this title. Counterfeit gospel authors, like the Gospel according to Peter or Thomas, pick names that seemed authoritative and authentic, placing popular New Testament figures as the authors of their books. The Gospels really demanded much-needed authority, as Ehrman claims. Why did the scribes pick authors who were not eyewitnesses, and also such obscure New Testament figures? Under critical review, the original manuscripts were anonymous and spread across the Roman Empire for a full century. These copies spread from Jerusalem to Rome to Africa. The scribes copied and recopied the four Gospels. Then, after reaching the four corners of the empire, all these separate scribes just so happened to assign the exact same names to these manuscripts. Seems rather ridiculous that they could conspire in such a way for it to turn out so perfectly. It would be a remarkable feat for so many scribes from such remote locations to all coincide in such a seamless way. Indeed, this would be simply astonishing for just one gospel, but four? Such a theory is implausible to be for thinking people to rationalize. Justin Martyr stated that the early Christians would read from the memoirs of the apostles, which, to be clear, he also called gospels. Think about this. When these churches read from these multiple gospels, it would have become practically necessary to have names for each in order to distinguish one from another. Are we honestly to believe the Christian communities read from various gospels for a full century without assigning them titles? Furthermore, the titles presuppose that other gospels existed, otherwise they wouldn't have the title according to. The early church valued both the authorship and apostolicity of the Gospels. That is, it mattered to the early Christians who wrote a gospel and what their authority was. Tertullian of Carthage states, "A work ought not to be recognized which holds not its head erect, which gives no promise of credibility from the fullness of its title and the just profession of its author." Likewise, Irenaeus held that those who denied Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were denying the companions of the Lord. Indeed, one way we know the early Christians valued the writings of the apostles so much is to look at the titles of the Gnostic Gospels, which were largely apostolic figures like Peter, Thomas, Bartholomew, Judas, and Philip. Papias of Hierapolis, born in the 1st century, writing in the early 2nd century in the region known as Western Turkey, said, Mark, having become Peter's translator, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered. This is where we get that Peter was the source for Mark. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. Mark did. Mark accompanied Peter, who accommodated his to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving an ordered narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherever Mark made no mistake in writing things as he remembered them. One thing he took special care not to omit anything he'd heard, and not to put anything fictitious into his statements. Matthew put together sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one translated them as best he could. Papias gathered his information about who wrote the Gospels through conversations with eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. His words were preserved by Eusebius of Caesarea from texts that he possessed in the 4th century. Irenaeus of Lyon, born in the early 2nd century, writing in the late 2nd century from the region known today as France, said, "There are 4 Gospels and only 4, neither more nor less. Christ is at the center of them. John actually speaks of his kingly and glorious sonship to the Father in his opening words, 'In the beginning was the Word.' Luke begins with Zechariah offering a sacrifice. Matthew chooses, first of all, the Lord's human genealogy, and Mark leads off by calling on the prophetic spirit which invests humanity from on high. Matthew issued a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome and laying the foundations of the church. After their departure, Mark, Peter's follower and translator, handed down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Luke, also the companion of Paul, recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned on his chest, published a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. Irenaeus probably gained at least some of his information through Polycarp of Smyrna, who was born in the 1st century and martyred in the mid-2nd century. Polycarp had been a companion of Papias. Both Polycarp and Papias knew John, the disciple of Jesus. The Muratorian fragment from the late 2nd century, probably from Rome, on whom the Gospels according to Luke and John were written. The first portion of the document has not survived. It says that the third gospel was according to Luke. It says that the fourth gospel was according to John. This is what the Muratorian fragment says. Pause it and read the whole thing for yourself. There's virtually no evidence to suggest that the New Testament Gospels ever circulated anonymously. There's no wide varieties of titles for the New Testament Gospels. The four Gospels were understood from their earliest stages of circulation to have originated with Matthew and John, Mark the translator of Peter, and Luke the traveling companion of Paul. Before the end of the 2nd century, the New Testament Gospels were already settled of 4 books with a clear tradition traceable through eyewitness testimonies to 4 particular 1st century authors. Taken together, Papias, Irenaeus, and the Muratorian fragment testify to the authority of the 4 Gospels whose beginnings could be traced to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In the cases of Papias and Irenaeus, the testimonies were traceable to individuals who'd personally encountered Jesus and the apostles. Internal and external evidence can lead us to conclusions about who wrote the Gospels. External evidence comes from outside a historical manuscript. It comes from other independent documents, archaeological discoveries, or other things. Internal evidence comes from within the manuscripts themselves. Let's look at Matthew. For more than a millennium, the church has attributed this gospel to Matthew, the tax collector turned disciple. All 3 synoptic gospels and the book of Acts list Matthew among the 12 disciples, but only the book of Matthew explicitly calls Matthew a tax collector. All 3 synoptic gospels record an account of Jesus calling the tax collector to discipleship. But interestingly, while the book of Matthew calls him Matthew, Mark and Luke both identify him as Levi. It's worth noting, however, that all 4 lists of the apostle include Matthew, and none of them include someone named Levi. Some scholars argue that these are 2 separate men, but most believe Matthew is known by 2 names, possibly called Levi because he belonged to the tribe of Levi. While tradition claims the Gospel of Matthew is written by Matthew the tax collector, there's plenty of evidence for and against the claim that Matthew is the author of the Gospel of Matthew. First, let's look at the arguments in favor of Matthew as the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Papias mentioned Matthew wrote about Jesus. The earliest external evidence that Matthew wrote the Gospel comes from a 4th century historian named Eusebius, quoting Papias, a 2nd century church father. The quote's ambiguous, and scholars can't definitively say what it means, but according to Eusebius, Papias said this about Matthew. Papias said Matthew compiled or arranged or composed the oracles or sayings or perhaps gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic, and everyone interpreted them as best they could. Obviously, Papias leaves us with a lot of questions regarding Matthew's authorship. Did Matthew write something or put together a collection of things that other people wrote? Was it sayings of Jesus or was it a gospel? Did Papias mean the text was actually written in Hebrew or Aramaic, or was it written in a Hebrew or Aramaic style? Or did other people interpret it, implying Matthew was a source, not an author? Or did they translate Matthew's work? The quote alone is not enough to prove that Matthew's the author, but that's not all scholars have to go on. Next, argument in favor of Matthew as the author of Matthew's Gospel is from Justin Martyr. He doesn't refer to Matthew by name, but attributes Matthew 16:17 as recorded in the memoirs of his apostles. Irenaeus wrote that Matthew also issued a written gospel among the Hebrew in their own dialect while Peter and Paul were preaching in Rome. Clement of Alexandria said that Matthew and John left us their recollections. And tradition says they took to writing for force. Matthew had first preached to the Hebrews, and when he was on the point of going to others, he transmitted in writing his narrative, his native language, the gospel according to himself, and thus supplied the writing by writing the lack of his own presence to those from whom he was sent. So Clement of Alexandria says that Matthew wrote it. Matthew is the most quoted gospel during the first 300 years of the church, and the universal testimony of the early church is that Matthew wrote it, and our earliest textual witness attributes it to him. Next, the Gospel of Matthew is highly organized, and since he was a tax collector, he had to keep records and accurately relay information. He needed to be organized, and the Gospel of Matthew appears to be highly organized, consistent with the necessity of Matthew's profession. Major sections of the Gospel are neatly divided into parts. Jesus had 5 prominent sermons, and the statement when Jesus had finished these sayings is consistent with the organization of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 13, the author gives us 7 parables in a row. In Matthew 23, we read 7 woes to the Pharisees. Many scholars see this neat, organized style as evidence of Matthew's authorship, but it's not definite proof. The Gospel names Matthew as a tax collector, so it's likely he was literate and would have taken notes. Furthermore, the author writes about Matthew in a self-deprecating way, calling him a tax collector. Okay, next, the use of the name Matthew in chapter 9, verse 9. Parallel passages and other synoptics refer to the tax collector Jesus calls as Levi. This derivation may appear to be circumstantial, but some scholars argue it could also be an indicator of Matthew's authorship. If Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a primary source, it's reasonable to assume he'd be comfortable changing his own name. D.A. Carson says it's significant that it is more self-deprecating than Luke's account, which says Matthew left everything and followed Jesus. Humble might be a more appropriate term for the author's choice here, but it could be argued that if someone else wrote it, they wouldn't soften the language. However, Mark uses the same phrasing as Matthew, so that piece of the argument doesn't really hold up. Next, the Gospel of Matthew talks about money more than any of the other synoptics, which makes sense if Matthew was a tax collector. The parable of the talents is only in Matthew. Gold and silver are mentioned 28 times. 28 times more than in Mark and 7 times more than in Luke. The author also uses specific money-related terms in other Gospels don't mention. In the Lord's Prayer, the author of Matthew says, "Forgive us our debts as we've forgiven our debtors," where the author of Luke says, "Forgive us our sins." That substitution sounds consistent with someone who handles finances, which is someone who was a tax collector turned disciple. Next, the church ascribed the Gospel of Matthew to Matthew. Matthew's hardly the most important of the disciples. He's hardly mentioned in the entire New Testament. If the early church wasn't sure who wrote the Gospel, why would they choose someone so obscure? Matthew's lack of prominence in the New Testament suggests to some that the early church must have good reason to credit the Gospel to him. None of these arguments make a perfect case for Matthew's authorship, but taken together, they do support the possibility of Matthew's authorship. In order to refute the centuries of church tradition, we need a lot more evidence suggesting Matthew was not the author. Let's look at the arguments against Matthew as the author. Papias' statement can't be talking about the text that we call the Gospel of Matthew. Despite the ambiguity of Papias' claim about Matthew, one thing is clear. Papias is saying Matthew was working with the text in Hebrew Aramaic, whether he wrote or compiled it, and others gave us the Greek version, whether they translated or interpreted it. The problem scholars have with Papias' statement is that the work we call the Gospel of Matthew reads like a Greek original, not a translation or interpretation of a text that was originally written in another language. That being said, it's possible Matthew wrote or compiled another work, possibly a collection of Jesus' sayings or a complete gospel in Hebrew or Aramaic, and wrote a separate original Greek edition later. A Jewish man working as a tax collector for a Roman government certainly could have been proficient in both languages. Most scholars believe the authors of Matthew and Luke wrote using Mark and some combination of other sources. Some believe Papias may have been indicating that Matthew wrote one of these undiscovered source texts. A tax collector wouldn't emphasize Jewish ritual or the law. If the Gospel of Matthew was written by a tax collector, the Gospel couldn't have such intimate knowledge of the law because tax collectors were religious outsiders. This could arguably be addressed by the use of sources, but there may be more reason to believe that the author was not a tax collector. The next argument against Matthew being the author of the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew 13:52 could suggest the author was a converted scribe or Pharisee. In Matthew 13:52, they read that verse and say that it's possible that this was written by a converted scribe or Pharisee. Is Jesus using this parable and the author recording it as a nod to the author's conversion? If the author of Matthew is a teacher of the law who's become a disciple, it could explain the Gospel's familiarity with the law and Jewish rituals. The Gospel of Matthew constantly reveals how Jesus' life and ministry fulfilled prophecies. Does appear to present the old treasures along with the new. The next argument against Matthew as the author of the Gospel of Matthew states that most scholars believe Matthew borrowed material from Mark. Similarities between Matthew and Mark, including the same wording to describe the same events in general order, have led most scholars to believe Matthew used Mark as a source. A man named Mark, John Mark, is believed to be the author of Mark. And he wasn't an apostle. Would Matthew, a tax collector and eyewitness of Jesus, use the written account of someone who wasn't there to write his own? Sounds unlikely, but it's actually possible. There's good reason to believe John Mark wrote Peter's version of events, which Matthew would have certainly been willing to reference. Still, this is an argument worth considering. So, did Matthew, the tax collector, write Matthew's gospel? Unfortunately, there isn't enough evidence to prove or disprove Matthew's authorship. The church has always attributed this gospel to him, but without a direct claim in the text, that attribution comes from tradition, not scripture. This isn't to say tradition's wrong by any means, we just don't know for sure either way. That's the end of Matthew. Now let's move on to Mark. Who wrote Mark? So you can argue for Matthew's authorship of the Gospel of Matthew, you can argue against it. Who wrote Mark? Several early church fathers wrote that the Gospel of Mark was written by John Mark, a companion of Paul and Peter. Through the game of literary telephone, we may even have heard that one of the apostles, John, says John Mark wrote it. Remember Papias, who said Matthew wrote about Jesus? According to Eusebius, Papias also claims that John the Elder, believed to be the apostle John, told Papias that John Mark wrote it. Eusebius, in the 4th century, tells us that Papias from the 1st and 2nd century tells us that John the Older told Papias that John Mark wrote his gospel based on the Apostle Peter's reminiscences. If that convoluted trail of information doesn't convince you, though, numerous other early church writers claimed that he wrote it, including Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement, Origen, and Jerome. These writers add that John Mark wrote the gospel using the eyewitness accounts of Peter. The church fathers openly admit Mark was not an eyewitness, but this didn't seem to bother them because he wrote under Peter's authority. Peter was an eyewitness. If they were inclined to lie, they surely would have invented the idea that the author was an eyewitness, and they clearly could have conceived of a better figure than Mark. Not only was Mark obscure, but he's only portrayed as cowardly, having defected on his very first missionary journey while with Paul and Barnabas. Why would the early church intentionally make up Mark as the author when he's not a popular New Testament figure? The internal evidence for Mark's authorship is another evidence for Mark writing the gospel. Within the book itself, we discover Peter supervising Mark. Within the book of Mark itself, we discover several clues that point to Peter supervising Mark as the author. To be clear, this evidence isn't conclusive, but it does support a cumulative case. First, by percentage, Mark refers to Peter more than any other gospel author, 26 times versus Matthew's 29 times. This could show that Peter's point of view is more represented because he oversaw the authorship of the book. Second, the author never refers to Peter as Simon Peter. This is quite odd because the name Peter was very common in Israel at that time. And yet the author never feels the need to identify Peter as Simon Peter, only as Simon or as Peter. This implies familiarity with Peter. Third, the author mentions Peter as the first disciple and the last. This forms an inclusio, or bookends for the work that demonstrate the author's focus on Peter. Fourth, the author refers to Capernaum as home. Of course, Jesus didn't grow up in Capernaum, so why call it home? Whose home? The text tells us that Capernaum was Peter's home, which again betrays the author wrote from Peter's perspective. Fifth, Mark was with Peter and Paul in Rome, according to the New Testament. Paul was with Mark in Rome, as was Peter. Peter also refers to Mark as his son, which implies a close relationship. Sixth, Peter's preaching summaries and acts follow the same pattern as Mark. Lane writes, while Peter's preaching has been epitomized for inclusion in Acts, it's clear that its structural development and emphases are accurately reflected in the Markan outline. Seventh, the Greek style of Mark seems to fit with a Judean Christian. Mark grew up in Jerusalem, and he was likely financially well off because his mother owned a house. Consequently, Carson and Moo write that Greek is simple and straightforward and full of the kind of Semitisms that one would expect of a Jerusalem-bred Christian. It also contains many Aramaisms, early Aramaic expressions, which fits with a Judean author. Again, the internal evidence is not overwhelmingly conclusive in favor of Mark's authorship, but it does add to the cumulative case. at the very least, the internal evidence is consistent with Mark's authorship. So who is John Mark? Mark was a popular name in the first century, but one Mark in particular consistently pops up throughout the New Testament, and he's believed to be the John Mark who wrote the Gospel. First appears in Acts 12, verse 12. Being miraculously freed from prison, Peter heads to John Mark's mother's home where the church is gathered. It says, when this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. But this isn't the extent of Mark's involvement with the early church. One chapter later, Barnabas, Mark's cousin, and Saul set out on their first missionary journey, bringing a man named John, who the Bible later identifies as John, also called Mark, as an eyewitness, as an assistant. The Bible doesn't say why, but Mark leaves the missionaries at Perga and Pamphylia, returning to Jerusalem. Later, Paul invites Barnabas on a second missionary journey. When Barnabas wants to bring John Mark with them, Paul cautions against it, citing his desertion in Pamphylia. The two of them disagreed so strongly they decided to part ways. Barnabas sailed to Cyprus with John Mark, and Paul took Silas to Syria and Cilicia. We don't see Mark in Acts after that, but Paul's letters reveal that they eventually mended their relationship. About 10 years after the divide, Paul calls Mark his fellow worker. In Colossians and Philemon. 2 Timothy 4, Paul tells Timothy, get Mark and bring him with you because he's helpful to me in my ministry. The early church father, Papias, claims Mark became the interpreter of Peter. It's unclear if he means that Mark interpreted Greek for Peter or because he preached in Aramaic, or if it means that Mark put Peter's oral teachings into written form. Either way, the early church appears to have unanimously believed John Mark was the writer of Mark's gospel, and no alternatives were ever proposed. He wasn't an apostle, he wasn't an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, but we have good reason to believe John Mark was in fact the author of the gospel that bears his name. Next, who wrote Luke? The early church credits the gospel of Luke to Paul's companion Luke. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, and others all list Luke as its author. Luke is mentioned throughout Paul's letters in Colossians, Philemon, and 2 Timothy, where we learn that Luke was a doctor. The Muratorian fragment from AD 170 in Rome says the third gospel is from Luke. It says that Luke was a well-known physician and that Paul had taken Luke with him. It says that Luke was not an eyewitness of Jesus, so he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. Irenaeus says that Luke was the companion of Paul, recorded in the Gospel of Luke. Tertullian says Luke was not an apostle, but was an apostolic man, not a master, but a disciple. He was inferior to a master. Origen says Luke wrote for those who from the Gentiles came to believe the gospel that was praised by Paul. So again, like Mark, it's highly unlikely that the early Christians would invent that Luke was the author of his gospel. After all, Luke himself wasn't an eyewitness. He was an obscure figure and far more popular, and authoritative figures could have been selected if the disciples wanted to make up something. And yet the historical evidence for Luke's authorship is so strong that it was unquestioned until 18th century skepticism. So for 1800 years, Luke's authorship went unchallenged. The early church credits Luke's gospel to Paul's companion Luke. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, and others all list Luke as the author. We said that already. At the beginning of Luke, the author appears to claim to not be an eyewitness of Jesus, but rather someone who's spoken to eyewitnesses and investigated their claims. That's what we get from the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. That's from the first 4 chapters of Luke, where we get that Luke was someone who spoke to the eyewitnesses and investigated their claims. He was known as a historian. Luke was regarded as a historian who was very meticulous with getting information. church tradition tells us Luke was a converted Gentile, which scholars suggest is the reason Paul introduces Luke separately in Colossians 4. And there's the passage from Luke 4. Looks like verse 14 there says, Luke the doctor, send greetings. Being a Gentile would also explain why the author of Luke takes such an interest in how Gentiles respond to the gospel. Given his familiarity with the Hebrew scriptures, however, some scholars speculate that Luke may have been a God-fearer, a Gentile who worshipped the God of Israel. For three main reasons, almost all scholars believe the Gospel of Luke was written by the same one who wrote Acts. Luke and Acts were written in the same style and express the same theology. Both books are addressed to the same person, Theophilus. Acts verses 1 and 2 appears to tie the two books together. If we can safely claim the author wrote both Luke and Acts, which most Bible scholars believe Luke and Acts were written by the same person, then we can use Acts to learn more about the author of Luke. Acts strongly reinforces the author's close connection to Paul, suggesting that the author went with Paul on the second and third missionary journeys and eventually to Rome. The close relationship of the author to Paul could be what gives the author of Luke grounds to say he carefully investigated everything from the beginning, right? Because if Paul was the one that laid the foundation for the church, Luke was with him for that whole time, he could definitely say he carefully investigated everything. Luke and Acts both use specific medical terminology, which would be consistent with Luke being a physician. In Luke 13, Jesus heals a crippled woman, and Luke records some of the miraculous healings. In Luke 13, the Greek words that Luke uses to describe the crippled woman's condition and exact manner of Jesus' healing are medical terms, something a doctor would know, but not everyone would know. In Luke chapter 14, Jesus heals a man with dropsy. Luke uses a word to describe the man in this passage that's found nowhere else in the Bible. While this passage is the only place where the word appears, it's a precise medical term. Somebody with Luke's background would know that. The use of medically accurate phrases and terms continues in Acts, where we read of fever and dysentery. Despite the support of early church fathers and textual evidence that appears to suggest Luke was written by Luke, the Gentile physician and companion of Paul, not everyone believes Luke wrote the gospel. There are several lines of evidence within the gospel that would support Luke's authorship. First, it's odd that the receiver of the gospel would be named but not the author. Luke and Acts were written to the most excellent Theophilus. Richard Bauckham notes how utterly bizarre it would be to write a book to a named person but keep the author anonymous, because the receiver of the book would know who wrote it. It's inconceivable that a work with a named dedicee would have been anonymous. The author's name may have featured it in an original title, but in any case it would have been known to the person who received it and other first readers, because the author would have presented the book to the person that he wrote it to. In other words, it makes far more sense that this book was written to a known person, Theophilus, by a known person, Luke. Bauckham notes this doesn't prove Luke was the author, but it does demonstrate that some author would need to be named. Since all the external evidence points to Luke, this would raise our confidence in Luke's authorship. Second, in all three references to Luke in the New Testament, we discover Mark mentioned alongside Luke. This not only implies that the two authors knew each other, but also that Luke used Mark's gospel as one of the sources. Third, the we passages help us to identify authorship. These sections in Acts change from the third person to the first person. This means the author personally accompanied Paul on his trip in these sections. He saw the initial evangelization of Philippi and traveled with Paul on his journey from Miletus to Jerusalem. Finally, he accompanied Paul on his trip to Rome. The author could not have been one of the traveling companions mentioned with Paul during this trip, because then the author wouldn't have said we. This eliminates a lot of potential authors and leaves Luke as the best possibility. main arguments against Luke as the author are the portrayal of Paul and the theology presented in Luke and Acts. Some scholars claim that the theologies are different, and then Paul. But the Paul we see in Acts is different from the Paul we see in his letters. The most apparent difference in the portrayal of Paul is his treatment of the Judaizers. In Acts 21, a group of them tell Paul to participate in purification rituals to prove he still follows Jewish customs and will teach Gentiles how to follow them as well, including Jewish food laws. He complies. We continue to look at arguments against Luke as the author of Luke's Gospel. In a quote from Acts chapter 21, verses 20 through 26, Paul said to Paul that many Jews have believed. People accused Paul of teaching the Jews to turn away from Moses. They wrote to the Gentile believers to tell them to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meat of strangled animals, and sexual immorality. Paul took the men, purified himself along with them. That's from Acts chapter 21. Paul is less sympathetic with Judaizers and calls Peter out for his hypocrisy when Peter joined himself to Judaizers in Peter's error. That's Galatians chapter 2. Paul confronted Peter and said that we are justified by faith, not works in the law, and the Jews were trying to be justified by the law. Peter was wrongly trying to force Gentiles to practice Judaism. Still, the Paul of the epistles makes it clear that sometimes advancing the gospel requires conciliation and concessions. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, to the Jews he became a Jew, and to those who were not Jewish, he acted as though he was not Jewish, so as to win those under the law. As for the differences in theology, most scholars would argue that the difference is actually the theological emphasis, not the theology itself, which can be attributed to each book's unique purpose. So did Paul's companion Luke write in Luke's Gospel. The overwhelming majority of Bible scholars says yes, Luke wrote Luke's Gospel. Between the undisputed claims of early Christians and the textual evidence pointing to someone like Luke, there's little reason to believe this Gospel was written by anyone other than Luke himself, who wrote John's Gospel. Of all the Gospels, John's Gospel comes the closest to revealing the identity of its author. At the very end of John's Gospel, the author begins referring to one disciple as the one whom Jesus loved, and eventually suggests this disciple wrote the Gospel. Then there's this is from John chapter 21, verses 20 through 24, when Peter talks to the disciple that Jesus loved, who is almost unanimously thought of to be John. Peter asked Jesus about John, and Jesus replied to Peter that it doesn't matter whether or not John stays alive until he returns. Peter's responsibility was to follow Christ regardless. It's thought that John is the identified disciple who testifies that these things are true. The disciple whom Jesus loved is traditionally believed to be the Apostle John. While this passage may seem to point to John, it isn't a closed case. Let's look at what we know about the writer of John's Gospel prior to this passage. The author of John's Gospel claims to be an eyewitness. The writer of John claims to be an eyewitness to the ministry of Jesus, and there's good reason to believe that that's true. The Gospel contains numerous details that appear incidental, some not even bearing a symbolic significance, like the number of water jars at the Cana wedding in John chapter 2, like how long the man at the pool of Bethesda had been crippled in John chapter 5, like the name of the servant whose ear was chopped off by Peter in John chapter 18, like the number of fish the disciples caught in Galilee in John chapter 21. Since these details seem so unimportant, it's hard to imagine that they would be noteworthy to a second or third-hand writer. The author claims to be an eyewitness. The places where the beloved disciple is mentioned increase in vivid details. In John chapter 1, John heard John the Baptist say something and saw the fulfillment. In John chapter 19, he mentions the 10th hour. Jesus dips a piece of bread and gives it to Judas. More details about the fire than Mark provides. Jesus' legs weren't broken, and the blood and water coming from his side. Who made it to the tomb first? And the linen wrappings, and Jesus made breakfast, and the exact number of fish. So this disciple provides more detailed, more vivid details than others do. The author appears to be Jewish. The writer of John's Gospel also records numerous details about Jewish ceremonies and frequently uses Jewish festivals to show when events occurred. This could suggest that he was not a Gentile, but at the very least he was intimately familiar with Jewish culture. He identifies the purpose of water jars at the wedding at Cana. He notes that Jesus was in Jerusalem during the Passover. He mentions that Jesus fed 5,000 near the Passover. He mentions that Jesus fed the I put that in there twice. He talks about the Festival of Tabernacles. He specifies that it was the Festival of Dedication, where another might simply say it was winter. He records that Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified on the day of preparation of the Passover. So he's making reference to these historical facts about Jesus as they and connecting them to various pieces of Jewish culture from the time. The writer also introduces Aramaic words like Rabbi, Rabboni, Messias, and Cephas. The Gospel of John was once believed to be the most Greek of the Gospels, but more recently some scholars have called it the most Jewish for reasons above. The Dead Sea Scrolls support the themes and imagery that John uses, such as light versus darkness and the children of God versus the children of Satan, which seems to support that the Gospel emerged from a Jewish rather than a Greek context. Let's look at the external evidence for John's authorship of his Gospel. The following church fathers seem to give John credit for composing the Gospel: Ignatius, Theophilus of Antioch, the Muratorian fragment, Tations to Diatessaron, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius. So all those church fathers seem to give credit to John for writing the Gospel of John. These authors stretched from Israel to Turkey to Rome to Syria to France to North Africa to Egypt. How could these authors have all conspired to get the correct name for this gospel? D.A. Carson states that the external evidence for John's authorship is virtually unanimous. Even critics of John's authorship still consider the external evidence to be formidable. In fact, one critic writes, "Of any external evidence to the contrary that could be called cogent, I am not aware." So the external evidence for John's authorship is nearly unanimous. Internal evidence for John's authorship. The disciple whom Jesus loved claims to be the author of the book. Several lines of internal evidence support that John of Zebedee was the author. Mark 14:17 and John 13:23 seem to intimate as much because, according to John 13:23, John was found at the Last Supper, and only the 12 were at the Last Supper, and John was one of the 12. The fact that the author was fishing with the disciples in John 21 at the time of the resurrection points to John of Zebedee, who was a fisherman. Luke chapter 5 and Mark chapter 1 inform us that John was a fisherman. Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, Philip, and Judas are mentioned. So that rules each of them out as the author of John's Gospel. James of Zebedee cannot be the author of John's Gospel because James of Zebedee died too early. John is the only gospel to call John the Baptist simply John, according to 1:6 of John. D.A. Carson comments, quote, "The simplest explanation is that John, the son of Zebedee, is the one person who would not feel it necessary to distinguish the other John from himself. John of Zebedee was one of Jesus' inner three disciples who followed him most closely, Peter and James, I think, being the other two, so it would be likely to see him identified as the disciple whom Jesus loved." Again, the internal evidence does not explicitly name John as the author, but it does support this claim. This is the first argument against John's authorship. Was John unable to write this gospel because John was illiterate? Bart Ehrman points out that Acts 4:13 refers to John as uneducated, and he was simply a rural Galilean fisherman, not a sophisticated author. Accordingly, John couldn't have written this gospel with such a poor education, and indeed he was most likely illiterate. But We disagree with Ehrman's perspective for a number of reasons. First, this is reading too much into the term uneducated. The term uneducated doesn't explicitly mean illiterate, but more broadly refers to being untrained by the standards of the Sanhedrin, as opposed to Paul. Indeed, the religious leaders leveled the same charge at Jesus because he wasn't trained in the traditional rabbinic schools. They asked, "How has this man become learned, having never been educated?" in John 7:15. Many ossuaries, bone boxes, have Greek written on them, and Josephus even stated that even slaves learned Greek. The first century philosopher Epictetus speaks about a man writing in an illiterate way, which clearly cannot refer to total illiteracy. Right, because if he's writing in any kind of way, he's not totally illiterate. As far as the bone boxes, previously discussed in this channel, we saw that there was a bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest. Second, this theory about John being illiterate and therefore unable to write the gospel is a lot to hang on one single verse. In this short exchange, the Sanhedrin couldn't have known that John was actually illiterate because he never tried to read or write anything. This is simply an insult from authorities, not an academic assessment test that measures John's reading, writing, and comprehension skills. Third, 60 years transpired between Acts 4:13 and the writing of John's gospel. If John wrote in AD 95, then this would have been plenty of time to learn how to read and write Greek. By modern standards, this would have been enough time to get several doctorate degrees. As one of the central leaders in the early church, there would have been tremendous pressure for John to pursue an education. Perhaps this is why John waited so long to write his gospel, namely because he didn't feel equipped to write until he had become better educated. For a parallel example, Rabbi Akiba was illiterate until age 40, but ended up becoming one of the best rabbis of his generation. Fourth, to answer the objection that John was unable to write this gospel because he was illiterate, it's possible that John used an amanuensis to write this gospel. Even Paul used an amanuensis, or scribe, to write his letters. Even though he was highly educated, John could have done the same thing. Since John was wealthy enough to have hired servants, it's plausible he could have received an education or hired someone who did. Some scholars propose that the textual evidence doesn't necessarily point to John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. First reason for that is that John would have had important information that isn't recorded in the gospel. The gospel written by the disciple Jesus loved doesn't include the main events where only Peter, James, and John were present: the raising of Jairus' daughter, the transfiguration, or the prayer in Gethsemane. Plus, John followed Jesus from the beginning of his ministry, according to Mark chapter 1, verse 19, but the disciple whom Jesus loved isn't mentioned until the Last Supper in John chapter 13. In addition, another reason why the textual evidence doesn't necessarily point to John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. Number 2, John may have been martyred before this gospel was written. Some scholars have suggested the Apostle John was martyred too early to have written this gospel, citing Mark chapter 10, verses 38 and 39, where Jesus may be suggesting that an early martyrdom was in John's future. The third reason why some scholars propose textual evidence doesn't necessarily point to John as the disciple whom Jesus loved. A 4th century church historian says there were 2 Johns. We're back to Eusebius and Papias. According to Eusebius, Papias claims that there were 2 men named John ministering in Ephesus, where this gospel is believed to have been written. Some have suggested the other John wrote this gospel, but Papias' actual words leave room for interpretation. Eusebius may have been wrong about what he meant. Papias mentions John the Apostle and John the Elder, both of which could refer to John the Apostle. According to Papias' words, all the apostles were elders, so John the Elder can easily be John the Apostle. What are some theories about who was the disciple whom Jesus loved? Given these doubts, some scholars have proposed alternative possibilities for the disciple whom Jesus loved. Here are 3 other people the unnamed disciple that Jesus loved could be: a literary representation of a faithful follower. This is unlikely, since the text only specifically identifies him as one of the people present, but connects the one whom Jesus loved to the author of the gospel in John chapter 21, verse 24. Number 2, Lazarus. Since Lazarus first appears in John chapter 11, verse 1, and 2 chapters later, the writer identifies someone as the disciple whom Jesus loved. The gospel also explicitly says in John chapter 11, verse 3, that Jesus loves Lazarus. Number 3, other than the literary representation of the faithful follower, other than Lazarus, the disciple whom Jesus loved could be Thomas. The disciple Jesus loved saw the spear pierce Jesus' side, and specifically asked to see Jesus' side when he's resurrected. The encounter comes just before the Gospel's purpose statement. So, did the Apostle John write the book of John, the Gospel of John? Despite alternative theories about the disciple whom Jesus loved, most evidence still points to the Apostle John. The early church father Irenaeus wrote, "Afterwards, John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia." Irenaeus lived in the 2nd century and claimed to receive this information from John's disciple Polycarp. The text seems to point to John too. The disciple whom Jesus loved was clearly close to Peter. Peter asks John a question. Peter asks John to ask Jesus a question, or the disciple whom Jesus loved to ask Jesus a question in John chapter 13. Peter and this same disciple race to the tomb together after the resurrection. Peter is fishing with this disciple when Jesus appears to them on the shore. Peter swims to Jesus after the disciple identifies him. After Jesus hints at Peter's death, Peter asks about this disciple. The close relationship supports the likelihood that this disciple was part of Jesus' inner circle, made up of Peter, James, or John. Since James was martyred early, and John is never mentioned by name in the whole book, which for anyone else would be a mistake, John is believed to be most likely the author. In conclusion of this part, at the end of the day, the Gospels are still anonymous. Not one of them identifies its author. We have good reason to support the author's church tradition is named, but we don't have to simply take their word for it. However, even after examining textual evidence and clues from other writings, none of the evidence for or against these authors is 100% conclusive. Critics like Bart Ehrman argue that the Gospels didn't receive their authorial titles for at least a century after they were written. But as we've seen, this theory fails in just about every measurable way. It doesn't fit with the manuscript evidence, the unpopular names ascribed to these Gospels, or the external evidence from church fathers. Furthermore, we learn that this theory is implausible, impractical, and quite frankly, unhistorical. Put simply, critics are entitled to their theories so long as these theories are likewise entitled to our criticism. Next, in the next portion of this presentation, I included a part where Dr. William Lane Craig was given this question, this objection to the Christian faith about the Gospels being forgeries. So here's the question from someone named JC. "Dear Dr. Craig, I'm an atheist and I found you to be very sincere and reasonable in your defense of the Christian religion. You address many of Dr. Bart Ehrman's positions on textual criticism of the Bible, yet I haven't found you address the main claim of his book dealing with forgeries. How do we know the Gospels were written by the authors listed in our current-day Bibles? The titles were later additions. And upon reading through the other books of the New Testament, a common theme is that there are ample false teachers spreading false doctrine. In short, is there good evidence supporting the claims to the Gospel authorship? And if so, what is it?" By the writer named JC. So in response, William Lane Craig asserts that we do not even need to be asking this question of who wrote the Gospels, which is kind of the idea that I had when I listened to Alex O'Connor's portion of his video. Craig asserts that this question is like a distraction in a rabbit trail, and I agree with Craig. The assumption behind the question of who wrote the Gospel seems to be that the authorship of the New Testament documents is somehow crucial to regarding them as credible historical sources for the life of Jesus. In other words, you can still regard the New Testament documents as credible and historical, even if you don't know who wrote the Gospels. Craig doubts that any historical Jesus scholar thinks that successfully identifying the authors of the various documents collected into the New Testament is crucial to their serving as credible historical sources for events or sayings from Jesus. So in other words, the historical Jesus scholars don't seem to find it that important to have to know the gospel authors in order to know that what is written in the gospel manuscripts is reliable or historical. Craig says the question misunderstands Bart Ehrman's central claim to be that the Gospels were not written by their traditionally received authors. Craig says that if the original Gospels carried no authors' names, then they cannot be forgeries, for they make no claims about the names of their authors. The concern better articulated is that the Gospels are anonymous, and that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have only later come to be associated with them. Ehrman recognizes that we can glean a lot of historical information about Jesus from the four Gospels, not to mention Paul's letters, even if we do not know who wrote them. Indeed, until recently, despite his uncertainty about the Gospel's authorship, Ehrman accepted the historicity of the central facts regarding the inference to Jesus' resurrection, namely his burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb by a group of female disciples, his post-mortem appearances, and the original disciples coming to believe that God had raised him from the dead. Ehrman's recent backpedaling about some of these facts is not due to his uncertainty about the Gospel's authorship, but to other factors. Craig finds questions concerning the date and authorship of the New Testament documents to be extremely interesting. Craig finds answering such questions not crucial to the reliability of the New Testament documents. So if historical Jesus scholars are not unduly worried about questions of authorship, how do they identify historical elements in the Gospels? One way is through the application of so-called criteria of authenticity. What these criteria really amount to are statements about the effect of certain kinds of evidence upon the probability of various sayings or events in Jesus' life. For some recorded saying or event S, evidence of a certain type E, and our background information B, the criteria would state that all things being equal, the probability, in other words, all else being equal, the probability of some event or saying is greater given, for example, its multiple attestation than it would have been without the multiple attestation. What are some of the factors that might serve the role of E in increasing the probability of some saying or event S? Following are some of the most important. Historical congruence. S fits with known historical facts concerning the context in which S is said to have occurred. So we can see that the Gospels are reliable if the contents fit with known historical facts in the context in which the event has been said to occur. Independent early attestation. S appears in multiple sources which are near the time at which S is alleged to have occurred, and which depend neither upon one another nor upon a common source. Embarrassment. S is awkward or counterproductive for the persons who serve as the source of the information. Yes, you hear about embarrassing details being a piece of evidence that point to the reliability of the documents. Dissimilarity. S is unlike antecedent Jewish thought forms and or unlike subsequent Christian thought forms. Semitism. Traces in the narrative of Aramaic or Hebraic linguistic forms. Coherence. S is consistent with already established facts about Jesus. Notice that these criteria do not presuppose the traditional authorship or even the general reliability of the Gospels. Rather, they focus on a particular saying or event and provide evidence for thinking that that specific element of Jesus' life be historical, regardless of general reliability of the document in which the particular saying or event is reported. These same criteria are thus applicable to reports of Jesus found in the apocryphal Gospels or rabbinical writings or even the Quran. Of course, if the Gospels can be shown to stem from their received authors or to be generally reliable documents, so much the better. But the criteria do not depend on any such presupposition. They serve to help spot historical kernels even in the midst of historical chaff. Furthermore, one of the most important developments in New Testament studies has been the identification of the historical sources behind the New Testament documents. One of the most dramatic examples is the four-line formulaic tradition about the central events of Jesus' passion and resurrection, which Paul passed on to the church that he founded in Corinth, Greece. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15 that I delivered unto you as a first importance, but I also received that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. These lines are replete with Semitisms and non-Pauline characteristics, which have convinced scholars that Paul is not here writing freely, but just as he says, delivering a tradition that he himself received, a tradition that almost all scholars date to within the first few years after Jesus' crucifixion. Thus, the authorship and date of Paul's letter, which is undisputed anyway, become quite secondary. What is crucial is that we have here an extraordinary early source outlining the central events of Jesus' passion and resurrection. Yes, this quote was an early creed and was written before the Gospels were. Laymen do not understand the historical method. Laymen who do not understand historical method sometimes demand sources for the life of Jesus outside the New Testament, as if a document being later collected into an anthology somehow impugns its historical credibility. Never mind. What we now see is that there are such sources, but that the most important ones are not those which came later than the New Testament documents, such as Josephus or Tacitus, but rather those that came before the New Testament documents were written and were used by New Testament authors. Like this quote here. This was used by New Testament authors, and it was accessible to them before the writing of the New Testament. Finally, when you think about it, the names of the gospel authors are quite immaterial. At most, what matters is that the author, whether named Luke, Joshua, Herkimer, or what have you, was in a position to deliver historically reliable information about the historical Jesus, which these gospel authors were. So consider Luke. Luke is the received author of a two-part work, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. These are really one work and are separated in our Bibles only because the church later grouped the Gospels together in the New Testament. Luke is the gospel writer who writes the most self-consciously as an historian. In the preface to his work, he writes, quote, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account to you, most excellent Theophilus, you may have certainty concerning the things you've been taught." So Luke wrote his gospel to Theophilus, and tried to set it up as to be read as historical fact. This preface is written in the classical Greek style, such as was used by Greek historians. After this, Luke switches to a more common Greek, but he has put his reader on alert that he can write, should he wish to, like the learned historian. He speaks of his lengthy investigation of the story he is about to tell and assures that it is based on eyewitness information and is accordingly trustworthy. So the question is, do you believe Luke or not? Do you believe that he had reason to lie? I do not. Now, who was the author? Who was this author whom we call Luke? From what he says, he was clearly not himself an eyewitness to Jesus' life. Luke was not. But we discover an important fact about Luke from the book of Acts. Beginning in the 16th chapter of Acts, when Paul reaches Troas in modern-day Turkey, the author suddenly starts using the first-person plural, includes himself as a traveling companion with Paul. Luke refers to himself when he says, "We set sail from Troas to Samothrace. We remained in Philippi some days, as we were going to the place of prayer," etc. The most obvious explanation is that the author joined Paul's entourage on his evangelistic tour of the Mediterranean cities. In Acts 21, he accompanies Paul back to Palestine, finally to Jerusalem. What this means is that the author of Luke and Acts was, in fact, a first-hand contact with the eyewitnesses of Jesus' life and ministry in Jerusalem. Skeptical critics have done backflips trying to avoid this conclusion. They've said, for example, that the use of first-person plural in Acts should not be taken literally. It's just a it's just a literary device which was common in the ancient sea voyage stories. Never mind that many of the passages in Acts are not about Paul's sea voyage, but take place on land. The more important points of this claim, when you check it out, turn out to be sheer fantasy. There's just no ancient literary device of sea voyages in the first-person plural. The whole thing's been shown to be a scholarly fiction. But people come up with scholarly fictions in order to discredit God's word. There's no reason to deny that Luke Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul who had the opportunity to interview eyewitnesses to Jesus' life while in Jerusalem, which means that Luke Acts can be viewed as reliable. Who were some of these eyewitnesses? Perhaps we can get a clue by subtracting from the Gospel of Luke everything we found in the other Gospels and seeing what's peculiar to Luke. Excuse me, when you do that, what you discover is that many of Luke's peculiar narratives are connected to women who followed Jesus, people like Joanna, Susanna, and Mary, Jesus' mother. Was the author reliable in getting facts straight? The book of Acts enables us to answer that question decisively. For Acts overlaps significantly with secular history of the ancient world, and the historical accuracy of Acts is indisputable. Classic scholar Colin Hemner goes through the book of Acts with a fine-tooth comb, pulling out a wealth of historical detail ranging from what would have been common knowledge down to the details which only a local person would know. Again and again, Luke's accuracy is demonstrated from the sailings of the Alexandrian corn fleet to the coastal terrain of the islands to the peculiar and shifting titles of local officials. Luke gets it right. That reference to Colin Hemner is also included in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, if I'm not mistaken. According to classic scholar, to the classical historian A.N. Sherwin-White, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. The judgment of Sir William Ramsay, a famous archaeologist, still stands. Luke is a historian of the first rank. This author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Given this author's care and demonstrated reliability, as well as his contact with eyewitnesses within the first generation after the events, this man can be trusted when it comes to matters in the life of Jesus for which we do not enjoy independent confirmation. This last point demonstrates that having some knowledge of the Gospel's authors can indeed be helpful, but the point remains, it's not crucial to know who the Gospel's authors are, to know that they are telling the truth and that the information that is contained in the Gospels is reliable and should be trusted. There is a chapter in the book by J. Warner Wallace, Cold Case Christianity, that would serve as a good complement to this presentation. And so I invite you to check out that chapter. That is chapter 4 in Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. There will be a video posted with that later on. It may not be up at the time that this video is posted. The video that I'm making today is posted, but keep an eye out. It will be posted eventually, Lord willing. So we can see that even if we don't know who the authors of the Gospels were, we can look at the evidence that the documents contain historical information. And given that the documents are 2,000 years old, they contain strong enough evidence to surmise that they are historical in nature and accurately record historical events. And that chapter in Cold Case Christianity here will serve, I think, as a strong support to that thesis. So, thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.